Seaboard and Western Airlines was founded by the Norden brothers, Arthur and Raymond, both World War II veterans of the Army's Air Transport Command, on September 11, 1946. Raymond, who had dreamt of starting an airline while still a teenager, became, at age 28, the company's first president. Older brother Arthur, age 32, would serve as executive vice president and treasurer. Together with some fellow officer buddies from the Air Corps and $20,000 in cash, they began to fulfill young Raymond's dream. The name these visionaries chose reflected the airline's proposed routes connecting the eastern seaboard of the United States with Western Europe and the Middle East. Other founding members of senior management included Henry Renninger, Vice President Maintenance and Engineering, Carl Brell, Vice President Operations, both experienced veterans, pilots, and aeronautical engineers, and Wallace Neth, Secretary and Director of Traffic. Collectively, they brought a wealth of knowledge of logistics, safety, and maintenance from their wartime experiences. The company purchased its first aircraft, an Army surplus Douglas C-54 Skymaster, on October 19, 1946. It was flown to an American Airlines maintenance facility in St. Joseph, Missouri for conversion to civilian DC-4 specifications. Stripped of all non-essentials, it could now carry an unheard-of 15,000-pound payload across the Atlantic. On May 10, 1947, Seaboard's newly modified and painted DC-4 was ferried to Newark to begin its historic first flight. Newark was selected instead of LaGuardia to ease the boarding of two horses bound for Italy. At the invitation of the captain, company president Ray Norden made the first takeoff. After fuel stops in Canada and Ireland, it went first to Milan. Its arrival in Geneva, Switzerland marked the completion of the company's first revenue flight. After the crew rested, Geneva Trader returned to LaGuardia via Brussels, again making fuel stops in Shannon and Gander. And so began Seaboard's 33-year odyssey. It defied the odds and survived while more than 2,700 airlines started during 1945 and 46 with war surplus aircraft failed. Along the way, it would establish itself as the preeminent carrier of cargo on the world's richest trade routes, routes that would eventually give rise to 25 different airline competitors, set a plethora of speed, weight, and carriage records, and celebrate innumerable industry firsts, among them: first airline to fly an all-cargo flight across the Atlantic, first airline to land and take off at Idlewild, now JFK Airport, first airline to fly support for the Berlin airlift, first airline to fly a military air transport service charter. With a plane load of Air Force fighter pilots, first airline to support Pacific airlift for the Korean conflict. First airline to order and operate the Lockheed 1049D Super Constellation. First airline to order and operate the Douglas DC-8 55. First airline to order and operate the DC-8 63CF. First airline to order and operate the Boeing 747F. First all-cargo airline to join the International Air Transport Association. And the first airline in the world to equip its entire fleet with inertial navigation systems. Those 33 years witnessed remarkable change. Seaboard started with cockpits that looked like this, and ended with ones that looked like this. Started out with scenes like this, and ended with scenes like this. Began operations from a freight terminal that looked like this, and ended with one like this. This is what Frankfurt looked like when Seaboard first started carrying cargo to Europe in 1947. We watched war-damaged Europe repair itself, as in this scene of Frankfurt City Hall, and helped by airlifting critically needed supplies from America's undiminished industrial output. When the Soviets tried to strangle Berlin with a blockade, the United States and Britain organized an airlift to supply the beleaguered city. 4 days after the plan was hatched, on June 30th, 1948, a Seaboard and Western DC-4 left Westover Field in Massachusetts on the first of what would end up being 106 transatlantic flights in support of Operation Vittles. Seaboard delivered, among other things, scores of new engines to replace those worn out by this unprecedented airlift, and returned with exports desperately needed to keep Berlin's fragile economy from collapsing. the Soviets eventually backed down and lifted the blockade. Loading aircraft was all done by hand in the early days, and in the case of the DC-4 could take 6 or 7 hours. A novel approach to facilitate such loading was the intentional tilting of the aircraft back onto its tail skid, as seen here. By the early 1960s, the emergence of freighter-specific aircraft like the CL-44 mechanized the process, greatly reducing costly ground time. By the time the 747 container ship arrived, 2 men could completely load or unload the main deck in 30 minutes, and payloads increased from less than 10 tons on the DC-4 to more than 125 tons. Early piston engines like these Pratt & Whitney R2000 on the DC-4 gave way to the mighty but troublesome Wright R3350 turbo compound engine, an 18-cylinder behemoth that powered the Super Connie. The introduction of turbine engines, in this case the Rolls-Royce Tyne turboprop, helped make the CL-44 the reliable moneymaker that it was. But it was the jet engine, like this Pratt & Whitney JT3D-7 on the DC-8, that really improved the fortunes of airlines. Jets were infinitely more reliable, durable, and easier to maintain. They turned airplanes into flying cash registers for all but the most imprudent operators. Seaboard 747s provided the testbed for this Pratt & Whitney JT9D-70A, an interim engine in the development of a line of huge, high-bypass fan engines that power many of today's most advanced jetliners. But technology was not the only thing to see change. Early Seaboard crews found themselves in hotels that looked like this, a far cry from the magnificent Phoenicia in Beirut, the Ilokai on Waikiki Beach, or the world-class Tokyo Hilton, which was our home in the Far East for many years. Seaboard uniforms evolved from ones like this and this to ones like this and this. Passenger terminals changed from looking like this to this. We were greeted with leis on some arrivals. On others, we encountered cows and even abandoned infants on the ramp. We were treated to holiday-like layovers in cities like Rome, London, and Paris, while enduring the stench, poverty, and chaos of cities like Karachi, Calcutta, and Lagos. We didn't always fly airplanes in our own colors. Over the years, we wet-leased airplanes, in other words, supplied crews and maintenance along with the aircraft, to a wide variety of carriers, both passenger and cargo. We initiated service for Luxembourg Airlines with this DC-3 and later the C-46. During this operation, our crews got to experience living in this tiny, quaint Grand Duchy. Who would have ever thought at the time that this photo of Bob Snowden and a deadheading Flying Tigers crew would portend our future? British Overseas Airways Corporation, Irish Airlines, Eastern Airlines, and Sabena Belgian World Airlines were among the early passenger agreements. A Trans-Caribbean Airways operation between New York, San Juan, and Aruba during 1964 and 65 initiated our wet-lease passenger service using jet aircraft. We invented the concept of block space cargo flying for foreign airlines such as Lufthansa, Swissair, BOAC, and Air Canada, in addition to flying traditional multi-year cargo wet leases for airlines like JAL. Lebanon's Trans-Mediterranean Airways, Venezuela's Viasa, Amri Air Freight, and the United Parcel Service became freight customers in later years. Seaboard's apolitical, low-profile business strategy allowed it, for example, to serve Saudi Arabia's national carrier Saudia and Israel's national carrier El Al concurrently, flying freight for both between Europe and the Middle East. Sometimes we flew into nice warm places like Wake Island, where one could relax, frolic in the sun, and escape New York winters. Or hang out at the pool in Honolulu. Or tour Singapore's colorful waterfront. Or do a little sailing in Guam. Or even some deep-sea fishing. But we weren't always so lucky. Just as often, we ended up flying into some frigid place like Keflavik, Iceland, or worse, the Dew Line in the Canadian Arctic, or to Alaska in December, where the days are only 5 hours long. and where, even in summer, you could be stuck for days in some desolate spot like Cold Bay, where the natives were, well, a little unpredictable. And the best restaurant in town was the mess hall. Some of us shopped on layovers, especially in the early days when $1 bought 360 Japanese yen or 4 Deutsche Marks, bringing home tasty treats from far-off places, or other unmentionables, while others spent their time in the crew room, getting to see fabled Istanbul from the air and how the continents of Europe and Asia are joined, or sampling Beirut's world-famous cuisine, at least prior to Lebanon's devastating civil war, were among the many joys of flying charter flights to literally every corner of the globe. On one such charter, in June 1955, veteran Arctic explorer Louise Boyd of California enlisted the use of Oslo Air Trader for a flight to the North Pole. After a stop in Bodo Air Base in northern Norway to fuel and pick up senior Norwegian military advisors, the 15-hour round trip to the North Pole began, using an unprecedented 3 navigators. Posing for this pre-expedition photo in Oslo are, left to right, Navigator Ed Powell, Flight Radio Operator Harry Newman, Second Officer Bill Dodds, First Officer Jock Johnson, Expedition Leader Boyd, Chief Navigator John Robinson, Aviation Consultant Thor Solberg, Captain Paul Mliner, Flight Mechanic Thomas Reese, and Navigator Rene Boshart. Throughout its entire history, Seaboard had a small but profitable passenger operation. Much of it was military, but there was a good deal of commercial passenger flying as well. In this 1950 photo, we see the Purdue University Glee Club about to board a DC-4 for a trip to Paris. In 1978, Seaboard inaugurated its distinctive captain's deck service aboard its fleet of 747 freighters. Initially with military passengers, but with plans interrupted by the merger to offer the general public a unique aviation experience, with 2 classes of service, the modern-day equivalent of passage on a tramp steamer, but with the swiftness and comfort of the jet age. However, this was the sight that was most familiar. And it was Seaboard's ability to handle even the most extraordinary request with reliability and care that contributed most to its reputation. As this photo of radio operator Boyd Higley comforting a frightened passenger clearly demonstrates, care was more than just a marketing slogan. Our loading crews, like this one in Frankfurt, became expert at handling everything from Rolls-Royces to rhinoceroses, and from perishable strawberries and shamrocks to delicate Wedgwood china and live whales. We hauled coffee from Entebbe to Djibouti during the coffee crisis, and brought the season's first Beaujolais Nouveau to wine aficionados in America. Here we see a baby elephant, a gift from the children of India to President Eisenhower, being put aboard a DC-4. Also carried from India, as well as the Philippines, were thousands of monkeys for research that led to the Salk vaccine and an end to the scourge of polio that so terrorized Americans during the 1940s and 50s. From its very first revenue flight, Seaboard pioneered the transporting of animals across oceans, voyages heretofore made by ship. Even on the fastest ships, such crossings were traumatic and often perilous for these unwitting seafarers. Animals of every description became Seaboard passengers, quite literally from mice to the very first elephants ever to ride in an airplane. Seaboard introduced the world to charter shipments of livestock, which could, for example, in a matter of hours, transplant a valuable herd of dairy cows from Wisconsin to the Persian Gulf. And we carried many of the world's most famous and valuable racehorses. We could airlift a child's pet donkey from Paris to New York, or deliver a 747 full of prized mules from Kentucky to the Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan for the CIA. And gosh knows how many automobiles, from single cars like this to 747s filled with Formula One racers for the Grand Prix. If it was valuable and had to cross the ocean, we carried it. Early on, we proved the value of air freighters by whisking tons of desperately needed cholera serum to Cairo and Damascus to stem an epidemic. Then, in DC-4s specially modified to carry litter patients, we brought GIs wounded in Korea back home from Japan, as well as from the Tripler Army Hospital in Honolulu. From the human to the humane, from the frivolous to the deadly serious, From the westbound materials to make war, as seen here, to the eastbound body bags returning from Vietnam, Seaboard did what was required. Of course, we made our share of mistakes along the way. We didn't always get our labels straight. Nor could we avoid the occasional family squabble where our metal was pitched against concern for the company's health. Nor was every touchdown a perfect landing. And we didn't always keep our wheels on the pavement. In fact, this same ill-fated aircraft, 634, seen here off the end of the runway at London's Heathrow Airport, was destroyed in a similar overrun accident in Stockton, California, 8 months later. A small fire in the wing ultimately consumed the aircraft. The 5 crewmen aboard this training flight, myself included, walked away without a scratch, but the 9-month-old, $11 million airplane became the most costly hull loss in aviation history. We even managed to embarrass President Lyndon Johnson when one of our trans-Pacific passenger flights was forced to land in the Kuril Islands by MiG fighters after straying into Soviet airspace. This photo, taken surreptitiously by stewardess Nancy Jacquier, originally appeared in Life magazine. It would be another 3 decades before the identity of the photographer of this shot would be revealed as Terry Carr, senior stewardess on that fateful flight. The aircraft, with its 233 souls on board, was released after 48 tense hours. But aside from a few embarrassments and bruised egos, we all took immense pride in Seaboard's perfect safety record. In U.S. aviation history, only Hawaiian Airlines, which started before World War II, compiled a longer record of no injuries or fatalities. Unquestionably, one of the contributing factors to this enviable record was the superb maintenance provided over the years by the Seaboard mechanics. Further testimony came years later when Seaboard was selected to do the maintenance on the Concords when they were in New York. Reflecting back, it was probably the love of airplanes, the machines, that most bound the Seaboard family together. From the Norden brothers to the dispatchers, the crews and the mechanics, this was a passion shared by all. So let's look back at the proud stable of aircraft the company operated during those 33 years. Seaboard and Western's first C-54 Skymaster was purchased from the War Assets Administration in October 1946, overhauled and certificated on March 14th the following year. We see it here awaiting its return flight from St. Joseph, Missouri to New York. After trying out several different paint schemes, including this one, the company settled on this, arguably one of the most attractive in the world, at a time when color was not in wide use either in automobiles or airliners. The DC-4 was a landmark airplane. With 3 times the range of the DC-3, it was the first conventional intercontinental airliner. Prior to its arrival, ocean crossings had to be made by ship, by flying boat, or dirigible. Our inaugural flight took place on May 10, 1947, under the command of Seaboard's first pilot, Paul Maliner, a superb aviator and skilled administrator whose impact on the flight department would be felt for years. 22 years later, 3 members of that historic first crew, Paul Maliner, navigator Henry Hagee, and co-pilot Bob Warner, Seaboard's number 2 pilot, gathered to celebrate Maliner's retirement. Standard crew complement on the DC-4 was 6, 3 pilots, 2 radio operators, and 1 navigator. Until about 1950, we also carried a flight engineer, who doubled as a flight mechanic, but none was required. Here we see 5 such crew members, along with a station agent. The introduction of the high-frequency radio telephone in 1950 eliminated the need for the flight radio operators to do the wireless telegraphy, and by 1952, they were all gone. Seaboard's ability to quickly deliver critical parts, like this 5-ton rudder stock for a crippled ship halfway around the world, made headlines for the startup company. By the end of 1951, Seaboard had 12 DC-4s, all called air traders, and named for key cities in its ever-widening global network. This rapid expansion was due, in part, to the escalation of the Korean conflict. Exactly 1 week after the North Koreans crossed the 38th parallel, Seaboard operated its first military support flight. By the time the war ended 44 months later, Seaboard had made more than 2,500 flights carrying 34,000 U.S. servicemen and 23 million pounds of cargo between the United States and Japan. Although the unpressurized DC-4 was forced to fly through whatever weather lay in its path, it did afford spectacular views of things like the Great Pyramids. Seaboard operated its DC-4s in 3 different configurations: as pure freighters, as a Pax freighter combi, as seen here, or in a standard 48-passenger seating arrangement. In the latter case, 2 stewardesses were required, and, following the demise of the radio operators, a 3- or 4-member cockpit crew, depending on stage length. In this 1952 photo in Honolulu, we see former flight radio operator Bill Callanan, now a licensed dispatcher, briefing the entire crew. 2 years later, he would be back in the air again as a flight engineer on the Connie, one of 9 former radio operators selected for such training. In an extraordinary UN-sponsored series of Exodus flights in 1949 and 1950 to bring near-starving Yemenite refugees to the newly founded state of Israel, Seaboard modified its DC-4s with custom wooden benches that could accommodate an astounding 219 passengers. To this day, no wide-body jet has yet matched the record 12 abreast seating used on these flights between Aden, in what is now South Yemen, and Tel Aviv. Seaboard's DC-4s initiated service for Luxembourg Airlines in 1951, Aer Linte Ariane, the Irish national carrier, in 1953, as well as provide major DO-line support for the Defense Department during 1955 and 56. The last DC-4s were retired in 1960. The unheralded Curtiss Wright C-46 Commando was based primarily in Europe and served as a feeder aircraft connecting Seaboard's main European stations with smaller, outlying cities. The company operated a number of Commandos over 2 decades of service, but never more than 2 at a time. This color scheme showed up during the Connie days. The last one, based in Frankfurt and seen here in the Seaboard World paint scheme, was affectionately known as Emma. She was finally retired in February 1970. As you can tell by her immaculate condition, this relic from bygone days was a source of great pride for both the mechanics who maintained her and the pilots who flew her. The company operated this sole DC-3, the legendary Dakota, in its European feeder operations, as well as in the service of Luxembourg Airlines. Here, Paris freight is being loaded under the watchful eye of the gendarme. In December 1951, the company made its second major aircraft purchase by ordering 4 of the new long-ranged Lockheed L-1049D Super Constellations. Fabricated exclusively for Seaboard and Western, the D model was the world's largest commercial cargo aircraft at 133,000 pounds and boasted a 38,750-pound payload, virtually double that of the DC-4. Connie deliveries began in 1954 as 7 of the DC-4s were phased out. On June 17, 1955, after 8 years of effort involving 70 full days of oral testimony and over the fierce objections of Pan Am and TWA, Seaboard and Western Airlines was awarded an operating certificate to become America's 3rd transatlantic flag carrier. On its inaugural scheduled flight, it set a new world record, carrying 32,000 pounds of cargo from New York to Frankfurt. The Super Connie gave the industry its first true freighter, as seen in this cutaway drawing, along with convertibility, and Seaboard was uniquely positioned to utilize both. It operated passenger flights for BOAC between New York and Bermuda, and between New York and London via Boston and Prestwick, and introduced coach-class transatlantic passenger service for Sabena Belgian World Airlines, carrying U.S. passengers to and from the 1957 Brussels World's Fair. It also inaugurated transatlantic passenger service for Aer Lingus in 1958, using Seaboard Connies and pilots with Irish stewardesses. In this rare series of photographs of the interior of Seaboard's Connies, we get a glimpse of yesteryear's galley. And laugh. By 1957, Seaboard was operating 10 Super Constellations, but 5 years later, they were all gone. Between 1956 and 1960, Seaboard had the worst years in its entire history, losing more than $15 million. Rate wars with passenger carriers and the vicissitudes of government contracting, with resultant overcapacity, conspired against the airline. And the Super Connie, with its inordinately complex and habitually unreliable turbo-compound engines, certainly played its part. Pilots used to refer to it as the world's biggest 3-engine airplane. Others claimed that the more you carried in it, the more money you lost. But like everything else Howard Hughes had a hand in, they were beautiful. The Connie closed out an era at Seaboard. In early 1960, 3 of Seaboard and Western's major creditors demanded new management and an end to the red ink. The Norden brothers lost control of the company, and Richard M. Jackson was brought in as the new chairman and president. He moved swiftly to reorganize and refinance the company, suspend all DC-4 operations, and move ahead with the planned introduction of the CL-44. Within a year, the company had begun its return to profitability. After residing for years at Idlewile's Hangar 1, Seaboard built its new corporate headquarters, Building 178, alongside the main entrance to the airport. Executive offices were moved from Lower Manhattan. On April 4, 1961, the company's name and logo changed to Seaboard World Airlines. Everything from the minutiae of toy pilot wings, which were pinned on our youngest passengers, to service pins, to pilot wings, to the corporation's headquarters. All were given a bright new look reflecting the company's renewed prosperity. Seaboard World's board of directors, with Richard Jackson as its head, is seen here in a 1972 photograph, and here on a tour of the company's maintenance facility. The new management team included, from left to right, Richard Trail, Vice President Traffic, Jackson, and John Mahoney, Senior VP Sales, Bob Neff, Senior VP Corporate Administration and Secretary, along with some old-timers like Henry Hagee, who was one of the first employees at Seaboard and Western and navigator on the inaugural flight. After holding many management positions, he ended his career as VP System Operations. And Bert Hubbs, who was a radio operator on that auspicious first flight and rose through the ranks to become a company officer. But what is most remarkable is that his 42-year career spanned both the Seaboard and Flying Tiger eras, lasting until the merger of Tigers with Federal Express in 1989. Here we see 3 key members of operations management: Jerry Farah, VP Maintenance and Engineering, Charlie Bell, Senior VP Operations, and Carl Hirschberg, VP Flight. Increased profits from a now all-turbine fleet allowed the company to expand and refurbish Building 178 and build a new cargo terminal and operations center on the airport, which itself had recently changed its name to John F. Kennedy International. Geared for the jet age and palletized freight, this new terminal, known to most as Building 260, introduced major improvements in mechanized cargo handling. With its many loading docks shown here at night, freight could be received from customers' trucks and put aboard awaiting jets in a matter of minutes. Seaboard was setting the standard in the cargo industry for automation technology. In August 1961, the first of 6 brand-new Canadair CL-44D swingtails was placed into service. This unique airplane, in whose design Seaboard engineers had a hand, was the first modern airliner designed solely to carry freight. This turbine-powered prop jet boasted a payload of 65,000 pounds and could handle a single piece of freight 85 feet long. Only 39 CL-44s were built at this Canadair plant outside of Montreal. Of those, 12 went to the Royal Canadian Air Force, the remaining 27 to civilian operators. While lacking the graceful lines of the Connie, this remarkable airplane proved ideal for the newly reconstituted airline, tiding it over profitably until the even more efficient jets arrived 3 years later. By 1962, the Connies were gone, and Seaboard became an all-turbine-powered airline, operating across both oceans, from London to Saigon, where an unpopular war was escalating and Tan Son Nhut on its way to becoming the world's busiest airport. Everything about the CL-44 was unusual, including the cockpit. So unusual, in fact, that Lewis Marks & Company brought out a battery-powered toy in the Seaboard motif, complete with operating wheels, propellers, swingtail, and navigation lights. Considering that Seaboard owned only 7 CL-44s and operated only 6, the appearance of this now valuable and highly collectible toy seems quite extraordinary. Seaboard pilots rarely looked with envy at other airlines, but in 1952, when the British began operating the world's first jet transport, the de Havilland Comet, the jet crave was on. Finally, in June 1964, Seaboard inaugurated jet service with a DC-8 55 freighter leased from the Douglas Aircraft Company. The Dash 55, or Mini 8, as it would come to be known, carried 13 pallets and a total payload of 90,000 pounds. The economies of the 55 were not as attractive as the competing Boeing 707, but Douglas had on its drawing board the Dash 63, a 37-foot longer version with a greatly increased range and payload capability. This stretched intercontinental model was destined to become the backbone of Seaboard's fleet and dominate the world's jet freighter market for a decade. The company ordered 12. To tide it over until the 63s arrived, the company took delivery of 2 brand new Boeing 707-345Cs, the last and finest version of the famed 707 ever built. The pilots who got to fly them raved about the 707 for years. We see one here earning its keep on a wintry day in Stockholm. The 63 convertible freighter, which arrived in June 1968, was the world's largest commercial jetliner, and Seaboard was the lead customer. Its registration, November 8631, stood for DC-8 63 number 1, and was the first of its type delivered. It could carry 259 passengers in an all-coach configuration, 62 more than the Mini 8, or, as shown here, 219 as specified by the military, plus a crew of 10. In a mere 5 hours, it could be converted to carry up to 112,800 pounds of cargo, using 18 pallets or igloos, a 38% increase over the standard 8. Its convertibility gave Seaboard enormous flexibility in meeting the heavy demands of the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, or CRAF program, during the height of the Vietnam War, carrying cargo one day and troops or military dependents the next. By 1968, Seaboard was boarding more than 138,000 passengers annually, and company employment rose to 1,942. Here we see a Pax bird being catered prior to a trans-Pacific flight. Unlike the Korean conflict, the Vietnam War required that troops and war materiel be delivered right into the war zone. Typically, sometime after the pre-dawn departures of the B-52s from Guam, we followed. Being much faster, we would overtake them en route, passing well below their contrails, and be on the ground in Vietnam by the time they reached their targets. It was not unusual for us to hear or even feel the staccato concussions of their bombs falling near Da Nang or Bien Hoa, or even have our airplane shot at with small arms fire. Another hazard was carrying Class A explosives. We supplied whole plane loads of rockets for the Navy's carrier-based attack aircraft, as well as hand grenades for the Army, as seen here during a refueling stop at Wake Island. On such occasions, we were treated like lepers wherever we touched down. On the other hand, and if only briefly, our stewardesses brought a heartwarming touch of home to the war-weary soldiers. Seaboard was quick to adopt new technologies, and by 1970 became the first airline in the world to have its entire fleet converted to use inertial navigation systems in place of navigators. By 1971, the company was operating a fleet of 11 63s and 3 55s, and total employment reached an all-time high of 2,132 people. After the first few deliveries, the company adopted a more modernized paint scheme for the vertical fin. When the 747s joined the fleet, the DC-8 took on a similar look, one in which they would finish out their Seaboard careers. From earliest childhood, most of us who have made our livings as pilots have fantasized about flying something like this, or this. And while we didn't get to fulfill all our fantasies, the pilots at Seaboard weren't left completely out, because they gave us these to play with. In August 1974, Seaboard's first 747 freighter entered service, and intermodalism using 8x8 by 20-foot air truck containers was born. Pan Am, the launch customer for the jumbo jet, had originally ordered 24 Pax models and 1 freighter, but the 747F would be delayed for several years, awaiting development of a second-generation engine, one with sufficient thrust to meet the requirements of the much heavier freighter. When that engine, the 53,000-pound thrust JT9D-70A, finally arrived, Seaboard was ready. Meanwhile, in 1972, Lufthansa had begun flying a converted 747-100 series passenger airplane with a restricted payload, that Boeing had used to test the 747's cargo loading system. But the first real F model ever built was our 701. Factoring in speed along with the huge increase in payload, this single 747 superfreighter could do the work of 35 DC-4s. Boeing actually leased it back from Seaboard briefly to display at the 1975 Paris Air Show, where it commanded center stage between the Anglo-French Concorde and the Soviet Tu-144 supersonic transports. The airplane was featured on the cover of virtually every aviation magazine. Pratt & Whitney, meanwhile, used it to tout its new engine, the most powerful aircraft engine in use. On January 26, 1975, a Seaboard 747 took off with a payload of 253,800 pounds, the largest weight ever lifted off the ground in aviation history, and carried it non-stop from New York to London. On November 30, 1976, this airplane, 702, set a world speed record from New York to Frankfurt in 5 hours and 33 minutes. Our cockpits were the most advanced in the world. Pan Am and other crews would often visit and marvel at the 3 autopilots and other high-end novelties. It was a pretty impressive office. Above the 27,600 cubic feet of main deck cargo space was an efficient galley and seating for 19 passengers. By 1979, Seaboard was operating 5 747Fs of its own, leased others seasonally, and had 2 more on order. Thanks largely to the efficiencies of these aircraft, 1978 was the most profitable year in Seaboard's history. The 747s climaxed Seaboard's long-established history of operating the biggest and best airplanes available. Marvelous though these machines were, it has been the people, and in particular, the special camaraderie that existed among the flight crews, that have left such lasting memories. We did training together. We went to work together. We took breaks together. And we had lots of fun together. But most importantly, and in 100 different ways, we were there for each other. Transcending mere friendship, nearly 20 such relationships ended in marriage, and more than 90% of those have been lifelong. This wonderful, albeit imperfect photo of the company's first passenger flight, which carried United Nations staff from Geneva to New York to attend the first General Assembly in September 1947, typifies that spirit. The 2 stewardesses were borrowed from Transocean Airlines, as it would be yet another year before Seaboard and Western would set up its own stewardess department. Jane Boggess is in the center, walking next to navigator Henry Hagee, whom she would later marry. Jane Breckenheimer, the second stewardess, took the photo. What follows is a gallery of crew members, starting with the cockpit. We begin this random cavalcade with Paul Mliner, Seaboard's first pilot, skipper of its inaugural flight, number 1 on the seniority list, and seen here disembarking his last flight as the first pilot to retire. Co-pilot on his last flight was his son, Paul Jr. Stan Lebedeus, Art Stelges, Chuck Berger with the Moray Eel on Wake Island, stewardess Gail Gwynn and Arnie Visnick, Ed Foster and Scott Ketcher, Dick Schwenke, Woody Woodrow and Ray Gray with the 707, Jerry Prince and Bernie Glick at an Airline Pilots Association meeting, John Kenny, Chuck Clark, Frankfurt agent Howard Barr, and Larry Sullivan, Danny Houlihan and Bill Tribe, John Morielli, Joe Restivo, and George Koch, Dick Ham and Gino Sullivan, Bill Neuenhaus, waiting for the steps to be rolled up to one of the 2 aircraft we had painted in JAL colors, Dick King, and Ed Cardinelli as a new hire co-pilot, age 20. In this 1947 photo, we see Joe Halsmer accepting turkeys from members of the New York cast of Ethel Merman's Annie Get Your Gun to be delivered to the American cast members in London so they too could celebrate Thanksgiving. Jerry Lehman, Bob Brady and Paul Salez, Here we see an alert but tired Bob Livingston. Of course, there was never any sleeping done in Seaboard cockpits because that was against regulations. What Bob is doing here is checking the insides of his eyelids. Bill Bond, on the other hand, developed the ability to give all appearances of sleeping while remaining perfectly alert. Skin Davis, Arizona Smith, Nick Poranese, Ian Adamson and Wally Seymour in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, George Ferrero, Mike Wojciechowski, and Ed Mitchell, Dave Hart, Jack Webb, Harry Soroka, and Freddie Blackman, looking pretty fresh for guys who've been up all night. The Silver Fox, Joe Kane, with Hans Fischer in the background. Fred Snyder, Ray Dorman, Sam Higginbotham, and Paul Jordan. Rich Botchke, Rich Kane, Jim Thomas, and Bill Thornton. Joe Tossolini and Salty Halls. Starting from the far left, Marty Pfeiffer, Niles Grover, Russ Thal, Ralph Neary, and Al Pizzoli at Kennedy Dispatch. Will Volkman, Flight Department icon Betty McCann, Wendell Hale, and Frank Umhofer at Wendell's retirement celebration. Maurice Murray, Mark Sattler, Ken Kahn, and Danny Breen. Nolan Gershenson, Bill Bovers, Art Neuenhuis, Bill Bond, John McGrail, Gene O'Sullivan, and Bill McMakin, seen here on Lobby Patrol at Frankfurt's Intercontinental Hotel. Bob Sorensen, Bill Dodds, Charlie Pace, Bill Tribe, Harry Donnell, Jorgie, and Bill Kearney. Jack Kellogg, Bill Lawrence, Roy Van Truen, and Paul Salez. Temple Robinson in front of an early crew hotel in Geneva. John Kessing, Jan Van Berkom wearing the blue shirt of Flying Tigers. George Hamilton, Howie Schlag and Bill McMakin with friends in Ireland. Carl Hirschberg, no doubt as he would like to be remembered. Arnie Visnick and Henry Brockington, again in Tiger uniforms. Johnny Bellata, Joe Bartnicki, Lloyd Churchy, Ken Axmaker, who, with either remarkable foresight or dumb luck, joined the Federal Express Corporation in 1974 while on furlough from Seaboard. Ralph Weber, Gene Grider, Jim Thomas, Matty Devine, Ed Gariglia and George Conway, Don Blinn, George Ferrero, Ed Mitchell, and John Campbell, the crew on Ed's last flight. Posey, Ev Keeler, Rod Peterson, Lou Furlong, Ken Chapman, Hal Bemis, Dudley Bolaware and Don King, Ike Battern and Sam DeCanio, Red Taylor, Bob Henry, John Locke and Chuck Clark, Jay Maxwell, Ray Molo, Art Koutras and Derry Alford, John McGrail, Ray Powell, and Carl Porsche, Hank Traeger, Link Dexter, Ed McKinney, Paul Jordan, and George Jacoban in Egypt. Al Prince, seen here in a Tiger DC-8. Joe Kuklevitz, Bill Eastwood and Klaus Mueller, Pete Solomon, Al Taberzi, Herb Stauning, Bob Potter, Dave Crutchfield, Ed McKinney, Arnie Visnick, Jim Mathis, and Bob Pritchard. Dobby, Don Cutcomb with deadheading crew scheduler Emily Stonich. Pete Duchesne, Milt Green, Lou Furlong, and Nick Horrock. Nick Tramontano. Joe the Pick and Freddie Fassbender. Phil Tomasky, Al Heller, and John Snydow. Pat Foley. Jim McCormick and Dom Chorcieri. Jules Sarver, Ray Vignair, and Frank Rupar in Coal Bay, Alaska. Ian Adamson. Ray Powell, Cease Bryant, and Ray Stroop. Hillary Lease. Bob Mangus, Bud Redgate, and Bob O'Donnell. Bernie Seidner in a Tiger uniform. Ed Powell. Rocky Boroff. Dick Hettenbauer, Paris agent Sylvain Ubersfeld, and Bruce Niebank. Harry Berlin. Bill Weldon and Noel Von Erf. John O'Brien. John Mitchell, Vice President Carl Brell, and Ed McKinney. Marty Salva and George Mayfield. Bill Hyatt and Bob Kern. Mechanic Whitey Alberg and Chief Navigator Bob Shipper hanging out in Charlie Johnson's quarters on Wake Island. Pinky Clark, Bill Eastwood, and Frank Umhofer. Ted Michelson. And here are a bunch of senior Eagles. Number 4 flight engineer Jim Ritter. Number 1 navigator Don Camfield. Number 2 pilot Bob Warner. Jan Irwin, who was chief stewardess from 1963 to 67, and Bob Snowden, the 9th pilot hired by Seaboard. All except Jan joined the company during its first year. Bob Straley, Rene Bossart, Ed Mitchell, Alice Culis, secretary to the chief pilot, crew scheduler Emily Stonich, and mechanic and legendary character Mike Arnone at Ed's retirement celebration. And finally, yours truly at age 29. Seaboard's first stewardesses were hired in 1950 and, over the years, more than 460 joined the ranks. Sadly, there remains little photographic record from the early days. Of those photographs that were found, several included women who could not be identified with certainty. Many of the early stewardesses, like Louise Robichaud, were registered nurses, as the military required a so-called flight nurse be aboard every flight. She is seen here in Germany standing in front of billboard ads featuring one of Seaboard's colorful Connies. Roz Grasher was hired in 1953, and when the stewardesses unionized in 1956, she became number 3 on the new seniority list. She soon became number 1 and had the longest career, 39 years, of any flight attendant in Seaboard's history. She is seen here in one of the first Seaboard and Western uniforms from the early 1950s. And here in a Sabina Belgium World Airlines uniform worn during our wet lease operations in the mid-50s. And, with Nancy Lovell, in the first Seaboard World uniform. The latter change introduced a new half-wing hat emblem. This was followed quickly by yet another uniform change. Especially noticeable was the lower profiled hat. This outfit was worn for 3 years, beginning in 1968, when the stewardess ranks swelled to a record 200. Typical of this post-Kennedy era in America, it was hatless. On occasion, our stewardesses, or flight attendants as they were by then known, would adopt the dress of our passengers. In the early 1970s, an outfit featuring a gaucho hat appeared briefly before giving way to the final uniform, a David Crystal ensemble that featured, among other things, these wings. As we leaf through the gallery of photos, the wide array of stewardess uniforms worn over those 33 years will be apparent. We begin with Terry Carr enjoying a South Pacific layover, and who could blame her? Helen Brown was chief flight attendant for many years. Mary Ellen Jablonski and Nancy Cuddy. Tina Mortensen and Diane Christensen. Diane Bailey and Sherry Hitt. Jeannie Cunningham. Judy Carroll, Velma Ewing, and Laverne Wallace. Pat Parlett and Key Hollister. Sharon Way and pilot Dick Moore. Pat Laska. Evelyn Hooper, Vicki Oswald, Key Hollister, and Diane Stannard. Jan Meredith and Tina Mortensen. Shannon McClung and Velma Ewing. Pete Forrest. Jill Judd. Diane Bailey outside Seaboard's office at Travis Air Force Base, California. Carolyn Okazaki with Mary Schulte in the background. Stephanie Webster. Kathy Dubacher. Elaine Fife with Vince Sproul. Holly Culver. Jeannie Crowley with Gloria Lee Holland. Sue Beerley. Joanne Benzing. Andrea Serrar and Judy Carroll. Donna Dodge and Tina Mortensen. Kathy Mansfield in Guam. Susie Hinton with Bill Dodds. Gloria Bowling, Ellie Pekopsik, and Jean Kenny. Karen Monk. Janet Shipman. Tina Mortensen and Carol Everhart. Ethel Payne and Fran Saito. Diana Benito. And, the last in our gallery, Peggy Barnish. During its first 2 years of operation, Seaboard aircraft touched down in 32 different countries, and this peripateticism never ceased. From Abidjan to Auckland, from Darwin to Delhi, from Kwajalein to Kandahar, and from Baghdad to Bandar Seri Begawan, we proudly carried the flag to every continent except Antarctica. For 3 turbulent decades, when forgotten people in distant lands were in crisis, Seaboard delivered. Berlin, Libya, Bangladesh, Java, Angola, Syria, Nicaragua, Egypt, Yemen, Phnom Penh, part of a lexicon of human suffering where Seaboard made a difference. There is certainly much to take pride in as we look back on Seaboard's legacy of accomplishments, sometimes made, as this required helmet and flak jacket imply, at considerable personal risk. It was the little airline that could. On November 3, 1955, Seaboard and Western became the first airline in the nation to hire an African-American pilot, Augie Martin, and it practiced equal employment opportunity years before anyone thought in such terms. And it won awards for its safe and humane carriage of animals to be used in medical research, as well as for its contribution to our national defense. And a presidential citation for helping America compete on trade routes carved out more by Cold War politics than the realities of an emerging global market. And it earned the respect of the entire aviation community for its remarkable safety record. 33 years flying all over the globe, often with minimal support, without a single injury or fatality. A small, dedicated, highly motivated professional staff, the Seaboard family, made that possible.